My name is David Pott. I'm the Climate Change Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Pacific Region based here in Portland. And I'll be emceeing today's webinar on behalf of C3, which is the Pacific Northwest Climate Change Collaboration. And we're a federal interagency group of climate change scientists, coordinators, science center directors, and others. So let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Dave Peterson is a research scientist and team leader with the U.S. Forest Service, the Pacific Northwest Research Station, Pacific Wildfire Sciences Laboratory in Seattle. He's also an affiliate professor at the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. Dave is the author and co-author of numerous publications and has been very active at the regional, national, and international level on the topic of forests and climate change and other issues. And what I've come to really appreciate with Dave is his interest in the interface between research and resource management, and really leading the way nationally through some regional projects here to work with forest managers on the issue of climate change, science, and adaptation in their forests, starting with the Olympic Peninsula and now a big project in the North Cascades. So Dave, welcome, and thanks in advance for taking the time today.
Well, thanks for the invitation, David. I really appreciate that, especially coming the day after Earth Day. I'd consider that a distinct honor. Some of you may remember the first Earth Day. It's been quite a while now, but I think we've made some progress since then, hopefully. Today's presentation will focus primarily on forests. I know you had a recent webinar by Amy Snover of the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, and so I will try not to cover too much ground that she's already covered. My focus will be somewhat national, but primarily with a focus on the Pacific Northwest, so I hope that folks will find some relevance to the scope that I've chosen for today. I will try to keep this to about 30 minutes or so that we have some time at the end for some discussion. So let's get started. So what I'm going to do today is a little ambitious, which is to provide a synthesis of this particular document that was published a couple of months ago. This is a report that was prepared for the National Climate Assessment. It's got a big, nasty URL down there at the bottom of the page for those of you who want to access it online. Or if you want a hard copy, you can either contact me or you can contact the Pacific Northwest Research Station off of their publications page, and they'll be happy to send you a copy. I think there are some left. They printed about 2,500 of these, and last I heard there were just maybe 100 or so left. So I'm hoping they will reprint another batch of them. But I'm going to tell you about this report today. It's not for the faint of heart. It's about 265 pages long, over 1,000 references. So we tried to be fairly comprehensive, but of course, given the rate at which climate change literature has been published in the last decade or so, it's not nearly as comprehensive as it could be. So our job was threefold. First of all, we did hold a stakeholder workshop at which we got quite a bit of input from a variety of different individuals, and then we pulled together the current scientific information on the effects of climate on U.S. forest ecosystems. This was all from the peer-reviewed literature. And then finally wrote this assessment. And this particular assessment is used as an input to the Global Change Research Program's National Climate Assessment. Some of you may have seen some preliminary draft chapters that were out for review the past few months. And the whole climate assessment will be published later this year. What you will see in the forest sector chapter of the final report will be about a 10-page distillation of what is in this much longer report that we've already prepared. Now, we had a cast of thousands here as authors. Actually, it's about 45, but extremely grateful to the individuals listed here who contributed. various pieces of this synthesis. It's not something that any one person could do alone. Those of you who are old enough to remember the first Earth Day may also remember these characters in the upper right-hand corner here from the Dragnet series, and of course they had this famous phrase, just the facts, and I thought I'd throw out a few just to kind of get us going. And I'd like to focus on what happened in the year 2012. You probably remember this enormous drought that we had. It was unprecedented in terms of magnitude, spatial extent, and persistence. And we had the warmest year since 1895. July had the highest monthly mean ever measured. On a global basis, it was the warmest year on record. And I just added in here that 8 of the 10 warmest years have occurred now since 1990. More area was burned in the western U.S. last year than in any other year on record, so that's almost 100 years. And finally, crop yields were greatly reduced throughout the U.S. and to such an extent that it had an economic impact on the United States GDP. So these are fairly significant events in terms of what extreme climate can do. Now, what if we put together several of these years consecutively? Then we'd really be talking about a significant extreme event that could have widespread impacts on forest ecosystems. So I just lay out a few of these facts to kind of get your attention and start thinking about extreme events. Sometimes I like to use some information from my past life, things I've looked at previously as kind of a model for what we might be seeing in the future. And I expect most of you are probably familiar with the concept of punctuated equilibrium. This is a concept developed by Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould in the 1970s. And it really kind of turned evolutionary science on its head. And they suggested that this gradual evolution, which had been previously hypothesized, really didn't work that way. And they said we get these rare events where you had rapid branching and speciation. So these kinds of evolutionary breakthroughs came only occasionally. So an example of this would be butterfly evolution. You can see on the left side where it's gradually evolving through time. That's the gradualism model. And the Eldredge and Gould model was you get these significant changes where you got sudden occurrence of species. So how does this relate to climate change and forest? I hope I can demonstrate that today. First of all, let's talk a little bit about tree growth. That's something everybody's interested in, how fast trees grow, both for timber production and for ecological measures of productivity. It's something our lab has done quite a bit of for the last 25 years or so. And one of the big questions you often get is, how will trees grow in a warmer climate? And I will try to give you a synopsis that comes from the National Climate Assessment technical report as well as some other research. So if we look at forests in the Pacific Northwest here diagrammatically, going from the coast to the west side Cascades to the east side Cascades, and starting at the top with the high elevation subalpine forest, if we have less snowpack and we have a warmer climate, we'll have a longer growing season, and growth will actually increase at these upper elevation forests. So there are not all losers in this climate change game, and I think that those trees will probably be some of the winners. Mid-elevation forests, a little bit hard to tell. It will probably depend on how much precipitation changes in the future. And then our lower elevation forest, nearly all these tree species we expect, because we have a warmer summer with less snowpack persisting, will probably end up decreasing in growth. So increase at the higher elevation, probably decreases at the lower elevation forest. Let's get a little bit more specific about species. Our classic west side forest, Doug fir, western red cedar, hemlock, spruce, growth of these tree species will almost certainly decrease. Now, if you remember, we tend to have a very dry summer bordering on a Mediterranean climate, so anything that exacerbates that dryness in the summer will probably cause growth decrease. High elevation forests, subalpine fir, mountain hemlock, lodgepole pine, some of our iconic subalpine species will probably increase in growth at most locations. And our east side forests are the ones that will probably take the biggest hit. Ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, western larch. These species are already growing in areas that are drought stressed, particularly in the summer. So a warmer climate, lower snowpack will almost certainly cause a decrease in growth there. How about tree regeneration? What will the future forests look like? And in order to determine this, you have to take a close look at limiting factors. And regeneration will increase when those limiting factors are reduced. So that might be snowpack, length of growing season, soil moisture in summer, and so on. So in our higher elevation forest, where we get a lot of snow, I just call them high snow forest here, if that growing season is longer, then regeneration will almost certainly increase. And if we look at the historical record and we look at warmer, drier periods of time, that's exactly what occurs at these high elevation sites. Whereas in lower elevation and dry forests, we would expect that regeneration will decrease because the growing season will be even drier than it has been in the past. Now, everything I've said up till now pales in comparison to what altered disturbance regimes will probably do to ecosystem structure and function in forests over the next century or more. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. First of all, just a quick conceptual diagram here that connects climate change with fire regimes, habitat, and ultimately species responses. So if you take this right pathway, now if you think about it, mature, older trees are really pretty tough organisms, and they can buffer a lot of the effects of a warmer climate. Trees that live to be hundreds of years old live through various types of climatic variation, and so it takes a long time to really have much an effect on them. If we take the left pathway, where we have fires reset succession. They essentially clear the slate, and they affect the temporal scale of the fire rotation, so they have a direct effect on fire regimes and all of these kinds of metrics that are listed here. So what we have in essence is that the disturbance pathway is a much faster route to get to habitat change than if you just waited decades to centuries for this pathway on the right side. Habitat changes can then lead to various types of species responses as listed in the lower box. So my whole talk here is essentially premised on this arrow that increasing disturbance will cause faster changes than would occur otherwise. And extremes are critically important in terms of ecosystem function. And this is our just standard probability curve here, where we have our mean at the center. We have a standard deviation listed here, and you see an extreme event here, 1 in 40 years. This could be a fire, could be a flood, could be an insect attack, something like that. Now, if we bump the temperature forward just a little bit, okay, so we're moving this mean just a notch here, that is not nearly as exciting as looking at this portion of the figure in the lower right, where this shift has caused a 1 in 40 year event to now become a 1 in 6 year event. So clearly that has a tremendous effect on how ecosystems might operate. It would have an effect on forest succession, productivity, all kinds of different things. So this shift in the distribution and at the extremes is probably going to be much more important than a small change in the mean of various types of ecosystem functions. And thresholds, of course, are very critical too. If we have climatic variability kind of bouncing along over the top of this general temperature increase, at some point this curve may end up staying above some particular critical threshold. This might be a photosynthesis level or respiration or water uptake, or could be any of a number of different things. But the point is, once you get above this threshold, things change. That's when you get dramatic changes in the ecosystem structure and function. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about a lot of these critical ecological thresholds, and I think that's one of the real frontiers of ecology right now is trying to understand this dotted line a little bit better. Now, a great example of having a threshold exceeded is this now iconic image of the pinyon pine juniper forest in New Mexico. This is a photo in 2002, and this is at the end of about 8 years of continuous drought. And then a year and a half later, all the pinyon pines in this photo are dead. Now, these are pines that are at the lowest elevation and geographic edge of its distribution. So they are truly on the edge, even in the Southwest where you have drought-tolerant tree species. But they were pushed over that edge with many years of drought, followed by ips, beetles, that came in and basically finished off the trees. The only green trees you see here are junipers, which are just a little bit more drought-tolerant. So this occurred over, I think, somewhere around 1 million acres or so. Now there are plenty of pinyon pines left at higher elevation, but it's an example of how a threshold can be exceeded by an extreme event, in this case, drought, followed by another stressor, namely an insect. And speaking of insects, I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with the mountain pine beetle story in western North America. Warmer temperature has allowed it to truncate its life cycle from what is normally 2 years to 1 year. This has allowed it to obviously reproduce much faster, as well as to expand its geographic range to higher elevations and farther northern latitudes. And so it's now attacking some species that it has not attacked before, species like whitebark pine and some of the other higher elevation 5-needle pines. And these outbreaks have continued over the last decade especially. This is just a little map of the Pacific Northwest. All the red areas indicate locations where mortality has been recorded. The red does not indicate 100% mortality. It just indicates the extent of mortality in the Northwest. As you can see, it's pretty much all on the east side of the Cascade Crest. A little bit of data just to show you the trends. This is trees killed over a 30-year time series, Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, which is in north central Washington. And you can see right here about the year 2000, the populations took off. So partially this is drought-induced, and partially once these insect populations reach a certain level, they go into a true outbreak phase, and they can attack even live trees. So this has proceeded rather quickly over this 10-year period from about 2000 to 2010. And of course, they also had lots of dense lodgepole pine forests, which are already low vigor, somewhat stressed, and quite susceptible to bark beetle attack. Similar phenomenon here for whitebark pine. And again, this is one of the species that until recently has had very little bark beetle activity. So this is a major ecological change for this species. And for whitebark pine, combined with white pine blister rust, that's a real 1-2 punch that is really causing some significant concern about whitebark pine throughout the West. Here's a broader west-wide map that I found recently where they have tracked, again, this decade-long bark beetle increasing outbreak across the West up to around 9 million acres here at its peak in 2010. And you can see this rather interesting drop-off in 2011. You see all the hot spots here, East Side Cascades, Intermountain West, Rocky Mountains, and the rather now famous outbreak in Colorado Rocky Mountains. But it appears as if the pine beetles might be running out of suitable habitat. meaning that they've killed enough trees that there aren't as many trees left as there were before. So this might actually start to tail off a bit. We'll see in the next few years what happens to this trend. And I'm going to show you one more thing here just for fun, and this is British Columbia. And I show this because it's a great animation of bark beetle attack. So just watch how that red increases and how the red turns to gray, which means 100% mortality, over the 2000s. So this is all observed data, and now we go into projected for the future. And you can see it continues to spread here at the northern extent. So by the time we're done here, it's about half of British Columbia. Now I'll let that play once more just because I think it's so cool. Notice the rapidity with which this outbreak expands between about 2000 and 2006. So by the time we're done here, it's about 30 million acres of high mortality bark beetle damage in lodgepole pine. Major effect on a large area and mostly within a fairly coherent ecosystem. Okay, well, let's switch now to another disturbance, namely fire, which is one of my favorite topics. And over the last year, I don't know how many different reporters I've talked to that asked me this question: how will climate change affect wildfire? And I just put this out here to see if anybody has heard this phrase at a meeting recently. I can't really ask you in cyberspace here, but it's something I hear a lot. Wildfire frequency, severity, and area burned are increasing. And often they'll say increasing due to climate change. And I hear this said by resource managers, scientists, NGOs, just a lot of different folks. But what the data say is, first of all, fire frequency has not increased since the early 20th century. And I'm talking now about western U.S. That fire severity may have increased in some portions of the American Southwest, but that could have been caused by fuel accumulations. And finally, that area burned has responded to climatic variation. But I think that the connection to climate change is still, maybe the jury is out on that one, pending a longer time series. So let me just bring up this idea of longer periodicity of climate. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It has these 20 to 30 years warm, cool, warm cycles. Notice that within any particular warm period, there are cool years, and within any particular cool phase, there are warm years. So it's not a perfect oscillation, but there certainly are some strong periodicities here. And now see if you can track this through the next data I'm showing you. This is area burn data for the 11 big western states since 1916. This is on federal lands in the western U.S. We've got hectares on the y-axis. We've got acres on the y-axis on the right side. And we can see this kind of U-shaped curve here, if you will. And this is often attributed to a period of heavy fire following settlement, followed by a period of active fire suppression and fuel accumulation, and then a period of fire increase due to a warming climate and burning up all these accumulated fuels. So I call this the fire dogma because I hear it so much. Now, being the eternal skeptic, I superimposed the PDO phases over this, and I think it's a pretty darn good correlation. And we see here warm, cool, warm. Now, we may be going into a cool PDO phase now. It appears we are, although, again, the jury is a little bit out on that one. So if we continue to get these big peaks here, then we might have to revise our inferences. So this doesn't mean necessarily that climate change is not affecting area burned. I just think we need a little bit more data in order to make that statement definitively. What we do know is that if climate change looks like a warm PDO in the future, then we're going to be getting a lot more periods of time that look like the right side of this figure with a lot of area burned in the west. So we do have some predictive capability here. And my colleague Jeremy Littell used this same data to develop essentially regressions between the climatic conditions for the future and area burned for the west based on that same data set. And so what we can see here basically is that the compared to our baseline since 1950, we expect a lot more fire in the west. Now you may or may not believe that we're going to get 500 or 600% more area burned, but remember these are just statistical models characterizing this. But I think we can safely say that area burned will be maybe 2 to 3 times higher in most of the West around the middle of the century. So if that occurs, that's a significant factor in both the ecological function of systems. It's a real challenge to resource managers in terms of fire management, fire suppression. It's a challenge to how we manage budgets for federal agencies who do fire management. Right now in the U.S. Forest Service, 53% of the total agency budget is committed to fire management, most of that for suppression. So it will be challenging to that particular dynamic if this continues in the future. Now, there are a lot of other stressors out there, of course, fungal pathogens, invasive species. Some areas have air pollution stress, fragmentation, of course. And so all of these things together I call stress complexes. So sometimes one factor can have the major effect on a particular tree species or forest ecosystem, but quite often we will have combinations of these different factors, often exacerbated by climate change. So let me show you what this might look like. For a species like lodgepole pine, we have listed in these boxes various stressors, and I'll just go through this rather quickly and show you how this might work conceptually. We have a warmer climate, so we have higher temperatures, more droughts, and as I go through this, the redder the box, the bigger the impact is. The extended droughts encourage bark beetles. We can then have more severe fires from the fuels accumulated, at least for a short time after bark beetle attack. And then eventually we can have a change in species composition, perhaps including some exotic species, depending on what the climate is like after this series of stressors occurs. So this diagram just tries to emphasize the interactions as opposed to any one factor alone that will probably change our ecosystems. So what can we do about this? And again, that's a question I get an awful lot. There's a lot of answers, both simple and complex, but I think the cartoon here depicts how our resource managers often feel. They're being forced to make some decision, and it's pretty easy to criticize regardless of what that decision is. So I think there's 2 general things we can do. We can try to slow down climate change, which means mitigation, essentially managing carbon. And we can try to buy some time for ourselves, basically prepare these systems and species to transition to a permanently warmer climate with more extremes. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about carbon management because this is an important component of the National Climate Assessment technical report. First of all, we start with this fact that currently U.S. forests take up about 13% of carbon emissions. And so that's a significant chunk. It's definitely an important service that forests currently provide. At the present time, because forests overall are regrowing from previous timber harvest, we have a net positive balance. But by around 2040, perhaps a little earlier, that will slow down and actually reverse as the forests age. Over the next century, we anticipate that carbon uptake will probably decrease significantly in the West, primarily because we're going to have this increase in disturbances, so it will be hard to maintain carbon in older forests. However, in the east, it's been suggested that where there is less drought stress, many of the hardwood species in particular may respond favorably to increased ambient carbon dioxide and may actually grow faster and increase productivity. Now, it's important to recognize that carbon management is just one of the objectives for sustainable forest management. And it's easy to kind of get focused on managing just carbon when, in fact, we have many other values and objectives for any particular area of forest. And I believe that carbon accounting and life cycle analysis will become much more common over the next decade. I would bet within the next 5 years, most of our agencies will be starting down the path of doing real carbon accounting in forested and other ecosystems, and the Forest Service is developing the methods and protocols for that right now. Now, here's some general strategies that we can use. There's basically three for mitigating carbon. One is simply to increase forest area or decrease deforestation, or both. So there we're just talking about the amount of area in forest. We can manage the carbon in existing forests, or when we do use wood, we can use it as biomass energy in place of fossil fuel or in wood products for carbon storage. Now, drilling down a little bit farther, here's a few tactics that partially are being used now and could be used more in the future. Reducing harvest. Obviously, on public lands, we've dramatically reduced harvest over the last 20 years or so already, not as much on private lands. We can find those areas that store the most carbon and focus on protecting them. We can implement fuel treatments where appropriate, and there's some caveats that go along with that that I'll probably mention later. We can try to increase forest growth where possible. We can store carbon in wood products. We can make our mills more efficient. And we can substitute wood for products or materials like steel and concrete that take about 10 times more greenhouse gas than wood processing. And finally, we can use wood for bioenergy. So again, a substitution effect there. So these are all kinds of things that are discussed in the report. I'm not really going to go into them in much detail here, but there is extreme amount of detail in the report should you wish to look at these. Let's switch now to adaptation. And if you don't like this word adaptation, I find some people don't. You can also use the word preparation. What we found in our report was over the last 5 years, activities in this area have really accelerated. And I'm pleased to say that our federal agencies have been significant leaders in moving this topic forward. To date, most adaptation has been of a strategic nature, and it's been a little bit more at the 30,000-foot level, a little bit more conceptual, and there hasn't been a heck of a lot of implementation in formal planning and policy. I've seen this time and time again where someone will do a really good job developing a strategic plan, and then when they get up to this hurdle of actually taking that information and putting it into a project plan or putting it into a planning document, they really hesitate. And there just hasn't been too much put on the ground. We're trying to do some of that. It's a real challenge given the lack of resources to do some of this implementation. But I think these last two steps are going to be critical if we're going to say we've successfully moved adaptation forward. We have put out some guidance for this process. This is a guidebook for adaptation in national forests that we published a couple years ago. I think it's probably generally applicable to most public and private lands, and people seem to like to use this as a scientific foundation for their work. We have a more specific case study here for the Olympic National Forest and Olympic National Park, and this drills down at a pretty detailed level in terms of both strategic and tactical implementation of adaptation in forest ecosystems. And the Forest Service has put out, or has developed, this excellent website This is targeted for resource managers. So it's basically science that's made available for applications. There are lots of summaries on there, as well as bibliographies and videos, short courses, all kinds of great information at this website. And it's a pretty dynamic one. They keep adding new information all the time. So what could we actually do? I mean, this is a really challenging topic, given that there's some uncertainty about exactly how warm it will get, exactly what the pace of warming will be, and how it will affect different ecosystems. This is an overview of the tripod fire that occurred on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest in 2006. And it's been suggested, at least for our dry forest, that we could move from something like this to perhaps something like this. And we do have evidence that that works. Again, from the tripod fire, the upper figure shows an area that did not have any treatment, and it burned 100% mortality. The lower one had thinning and prescribed burning, and had about 90% survival of the overstory. So we know this works. And even at high elevation, we found that some of the areas that had been clear-cut previously, but also had prescribed burns to remove surface fuels, those were the only green areas left across some of this landscape, the only real source of kind of a refugial biodiversity. So recently I was giving a talk, and I put this little statement up there: "Is forest harvest a tool for building resilience?" So that got a little conversation going. But the challenge here is, how do we do this at large scales? How do we increase resilience across large landscapes? And I'm just going to suggest a few different things here of a general nature. The first option being increasing landscape diversity. So if we can have some diverse stand structures and species assemblages out there, we're more likely to have, we aren't putting all our eggs in one basket. We're kind of hedging our bets that we'll have a variety of different conditions available, thereby increasing resilience to things like fire and insects. Increasing, or maybe I should say altering, biological diversity. What would happen if we started planting outside our traditional seed zones? If we started planting with genotypes that were from warmer areas, either down lower elevation or farther south, this is something that's being discussed now quite heavily, as well as perhaps more mixed species planting and fewer monocultures. Increased resilience at larger spatial scales. You know, we're pretty good at the small clear cut and the small treatment. We're not very good at treatments at thousands of acres, which is probably where we should be doing them in the future, making sure that we orient them strategically, especially our thinning and fuel treatments. And I really think it would be helpful if we start to think of large disturbances as opportunities, because in most of our landscapes, it's not a matter of if, but when they will occur. So let's go ahead and develop those plans and our objectives, get everything approved before the big fire occurs, before the big insect attack occurs. Then when they do happen, we're ready for action. And then finally, a preventative option, which is this idea of early detection, rapid response, simply refers to getting out there after a fire, after a disturbance, and tracking down our invasive species and getting rid of them. Now, I didn't say very much at all about species here when I was talking about disturbances. And that is not to say they aren't important, but I think it will be challenging in the future to protect every single species. And I think it may be more profitable to focus on protecting ecosystem function and processes, because those may be able to persist even if species are extirpated locally. Hopefully we don't get too many extinctions, but we have to realize these species may be moving around on the landscape as well. So I think a focus on function processes may be more profitable in the long run. Just a quick word on social and economic effects, because this was an important part of the report. The effects are going to vary a lot as a function of land ownership and different vulnerabilities and the resource dependence of local communities. And those areas that are tied to natural resource-based goods and services will be the most vulnerable in the future. there will be big differences depending on whether your systems are in rural, wildland-urban interface or urban forests. And if those socioeconomic factors tend to be diverse in the first place, so if you aren't totally dependent on, say, timber harvesting, if your local economy depends on a variety of different businesses, then you're more likely to be resilient to changing conditions in the future. I feel that private landowners will probably respond faster, especially to market forces and policies. So we may not think of our private landowners as primary movers and shakers in terms of scientific implementations in the field, but if they're motivated to do so economically, I think they will. We're going to probably continue to lose forest land as a result of urbanization, so that's perhaps a net loss of forest land, a net loss of carbon. Our Native American neighbors who are located on fixed reservations don't have a lot of options. They can't move around. Their land base is staying the same, so they have to respond to what's going on around them. I think we're a long way off from having sufficient organizational capacity in a lot of our institutions to respond quickly. It's starting to develop. I see some promising signs, but I think we have a long way to go. And our report also suggested that risk assessment is a way to improve our ability to quantify climate change effects. And I'll just show you a real quick example. This is a really simple 3x3 matrix of risk assessment where we have the magnitude of consequences on the y-axis, the likelihood of impact on the x-axis. And so the more you get into the high zone, you transition from this kind of safe area down here into a vulnerable and perhaps dangerous area in the upper right. So it's just a visual way of looking at things. A quick example here for carbon, and I don't want you to look at all this stuff on the right side here, but basically what they do is position these different forest carbon pools, the different colored dots here, and then we expect that in the future we'll probably be moving in the direction of these little red arrows to increasingly vulnerable positions in this risk diagram. Now, it's a subjective judgment as to what is high or low. So this is essentially just I would say it's a visual guide for how one can look at this in the future. And I think it could be actually quite useful for managers. If you just can't get enough of this kind of stuff, we will have a book coming out hopefully later this summer. It'll be a little bit more succinct than that long report. And like I said, we hope it will come out later this year. So I always like to close with this cartoon. Some of you have seen this before, and it's a reminder to me to say that there's an awful lot of things that we can do in resource management and policy development that are good for a number of reasons. So sustainable forest management includes a lot of different factors that are compatible with adapting to climate change, and I would say somewhere between 70 to 80% of what we are already doing is fairly compatible with preparing for a warmer climate. So we need to focus on perhaps the positives as much as we tend to focus on the negatives. So that's all I have to say for today. So back to David, and you can guide us through any discussion we have here.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Great talk and a lot of interesting points there. So I want to encourage folks to ask questions via chat, and I will open up the phone lines in just a second. And perhaps to start us off, Dave, I was wondering if you could let us know if there's been any research. You mentioned there's been quite a bit of disturbance in the last 20 years. Is there any research to show that we are seeing some species composition changes or other types of changes that you kind of started off your talk with?
Yeah.
In the Pacific Northwest? I think I've seen more research on that or publications on that about the Southwest or the Kenai Peninsula and different areas, but are you seeing that in the research?
Well, you just took the words right out of my mouth, David. I was going to talk about the Southwest, where we're seeing regeneration being rather slow in some of these areas that have experienced large fires. Same thing in some of the boreal forest of Alaska. I am unaware of any particular changes in Pacific Northwest forests. Some of our subalpine forests that have been burned are very slow to regenerate anyway, so it's a little difficult to say whether or not that slow regeneration that we're seeing now in some areas is normal or not. So I'm unaware of any particular examples, but if folks know that, I'd love to hear about it.
And as I unmute your lines from this end, if those of you who, if you could mute your line on your end unless you do have a question. Let me go ahead with one more chat question. Someone has asked if anyone has started an intensive analysis of seed zones to provide advice on which ecotypes and species to move where and when during plant regeneration efforts, for example.
Could you say, for some reason I couldn't quite hear all that, David. Could you just repeat that?
Yeah, and I may ask again for folks to mute their lines as I unmute yours from my end here. The question was, has anyone started intensive analysis of seed zones to provide advice on which ecotypes and species to move or to replant?
Okay.
When to do that?
You know, I'm not really, I know it's a topic of discussion. I don't know if that's occurring on a formal basis in the Pacific Northwest, so I'd love to hear about that. What I can mute off. Province of British Columbia, they recently revised their seed zones for all their major forest species, and so they now have a new list that covers the entire province, but they have not really implemented it yet. So it's kind of waiting to go, and I'm not sure if they're waiting for some policy decision on implementation, but they have at least gone that far.
Okay, great. And so I have opened up the phone lines. Is there anyone on the phone that'd like to ask a question or make a comment?
David, this is Tim Ayer. I add a question on the chat that I sent you, but I can ask it over the phone too.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, we're expecting a 2- to 3-fold increase in forest fires by mid-century. I think I heard you say, Dave.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, since forest fires are a source of carbon dioxide, how does that compare to other sources of carbon dioxide? Is that a pretty significant positive feedback in a way?
It's a very significant effect, actually. And I'm going to be challenged here on giving you actual numbers, but that is something we could ask, is how does that compare to emissions? But yes, it is significant. Now, I think the way I look at this is you can look at this as individual large pulses, or you might also look at it as short-term, smaller pulses, which could be achieved through decomposition, which could also be achieved through fuel treatment. And this gets back to something I mentioned earlier, that fuel treatments will definitely help to reduce the severity of fires. They won't stop them, but at least you won't have those enormous pulses of carbon and losses of nutrients and so forth over time. So you're right, it's a big source of greenhouse gases. I don't think we've fully evaluated that in terms of large landscapes over long periods of time, though.
Okay, Dave, and we have another question on the chat. One person says she's confused where the recommendation to reduce harvest fits. Most suggestions indicate an opportunity to increase harvest, restore more acres, use more wood instead of burning of other building materials, etc. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, of course, there's quite a debate both on the scientific side and the management policy side of this issue right now. On the one hand, if you were to protect all forests and never cut anything and never burn them, you'd continue to accumulate carbon for hundreds of years. So that's one way to do it. The other way, this idea of substituting through the use of wood products where you store the carbon long-term in wood and or substitute it for other materials like steel and concrete has been suggested as a way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that assumes a lot of different things about the durability of the products, how long they last before they are then burned or somehow that carbon is emitted to the atmosphere. And personally, I think a lot of the answers, quote unquote, that people derive from their models and their estimates depend almost exclusively on their assumptions about sources, sinks, and rates of emissions of carbon. So what I would say is if there's an optimal way to look at this, those landscapes that are able to store a lot of carbon in forest maybe are those that could be focused on for protection, whereas the other areas could be used more for utilization and wood products and bioenergy.
Great, and I see we have a question from Nancy Green. Are you on the line?
I am on the line. Hi, great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's just a comment, and that is for folks who aren't familiar with it, the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy was released, I don't know, about 2 weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, and it actually it has some actions in it that relate to both translocating species and seed banking. So I just wanted to bring those to the attention of people. So one of the action items is to develop criteria and guidelines to foster, I'm quoting here, foster the appropriate use and discourage inappropriate use of translocation, assisted relocation, and captive breeding as climate adaptation strategies. And this is for both plants and animals. There is a Federal Natural Resources Interagency Working Group that has informally gotten together here in Washington, D.C., actually started by the Forest Service to look into this. And then there's a whole set of actions under what's called Strategy 2.3. This is under a goal for managing species and habitats to protect ecosystem functions and provide sustainable cultural subsistence, recreational, and commercial use under climate change. So there's a whole strategy about conserving genetic diversity, and it includes things like protecting and maintaining high-quality native seed sources and developing protocols for propagation techniques for genetic diversity or particularly at-risk species of plants and animals, doing seed banks, ex situ living collections, etc. So I just want to point this out to people that there's kind of like this is getting some national attention now and a national framework that's totally consistent with what you're saying.
Well, thank you for that comment, Nancy. And I should have put up a slide of that new strategy. It was a total oversight on my part, so I apologize for that. And I will rectify that in my next presentation. I would be interested in your or other folks' opinion on this concept of altered seed zones and managed relocation in general, because I think while there's a lot of buzz about it, I know almost every group I talk to, whether it's a plant group or whether it's an animal group, people seem very hesitant to move forward with it. It's as if, well, we really have to be very convinced this is a good idea. Otherwise, we're concerned that we're going to maybe screw things up worse than they already are. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Loads of them. From the world of endangered species, we have quite a history of using translocations, usually within the range of a species, occasionally outside the range. And we've been actually doing a literature review of, not for all taxa because that would be overwhelming, but I'm about to get the results of one for threatened and endangered species. A colleague of mine did one for all mammals worldwide. And I can tell you the history of doing translocations, at least with animal species, has been extremely mixed. It's it's quite costly. The number of situations in which it is, quote, successful, and even what success is pretty limited. Huge numbers of failures. Many examples of unintended consequences that are negative for other species. So within at least the Endangered Species Program here at Fish and Wildlife Service, when I mention this as a possibility, I get a knee-jerk reaction that's very negative, just because of a lot of past history. That isn't to say that it's something that doesn't happen and that we don't do, but it's something that needs a great deal of thought. Certainly under the Endangered Species Act, if a tree species, for example, is going to be moved outside its range, or any species actually is going to be moved outside of its range, there would be a Section 7 consultation requirement if it involves federal lands or federal money. There's been scientific debate, and some scientists have come out very, very strongly in published papers against the idea of doing this, especially moving species outside their range just because of past history of problems. There are other scientists that are pretty adamant that we ought to be doing this to avoid, particularly to avoid extinction of species, or to address ecosystem services, because things are going to be so messed up anyway that species are going to move whether we like it or not, and that we really need some guidelines to figure out whether to do this, when to do it, if we are going to do it, and how to do it, so that it's done in a smart way instead of in a way that just sort of gets the genie out of the bottle. So that was the idea behind forming this informal working group at a federal agency level. We all know that we need to have some guidance on whether and when and how to do this, and we thought we would get together and do it collectively.
Let me just turn it over to, is there anyone in the west or northwest that has an example in a forest ecosystem setting? If not, Louisa, you had a question related to timber harvest. Did you want to go ahead and voice that?
Sure. You know, Dave, you talked about areas where we can limit harvest versus areas where maybe we should be harvesting a little more. By that, do you mean we would limit, the idea is to limit harvest in the areas that are essentially buffered from climate change? You often hear these called climate change refugia.
Well, I think that's one possibility. I'm thinking of the more, you know, our kind of west side, high rainfall areas where we tend to have highly productive systems. And, you know, right now, most of those, at least in public lands, are protected anyway. So it's kind of a win-win in that respect. But, yeah, you can certainly look at them as being less vulnerable systems as well.
And kind of a related question on chat here, is intensive management on a few acres better or worse than restoration-based thinning on many acres to meet societal needs for timber? And then I would add to that for, you know, climate change resiliency.
Well, I should turn that one to Louisa.
Yeah.
But I think it really is very landscape specific. You know, you have to take into consideration the local topography, fuels, which resource values are being managed for in a particular location. I think what we might want to get away from is this idea of managing for everything on every acre and maybe specialize a little bit more, and different sections are managed for different resource emphases. I think we do that actually in a certain respect. But I think we just have to take it situation by situation in terms of the intensiveness of the management and the appropriateness of intensive management for any particular location. Looking at both, you know, not just the short-term benefits or values, but also the very long-term benefits, and that can probably be looked at spatially across, hundreds of thousands of acres to see, what is the best mix of different land uses across a large area, and then see how that might be optimized for both climate change adaptation and things like, providing some value to reducing fire severity. Louisa, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, this is a very question we're struggling with in Western Oregon plans that we're revising. And we know that, for instance, in our southern districts, they're going to be the ones that are more vulnerable to climate change because they're drier. Our northern districts will theoretically be less vulnerable to climate change. And we're trying to balance the demands, particularly given all the politics surrounding the O&C land management. It's going to be an interesting journey.
Yeah, really.
We do have kind of a cooperative study going on you might be interested in Panther Creek in the Coast Range that involves Bureau of Land Management, Weyerhaeuser, EPA, Oregon Department of Forestry, and a couple of other entities who escape me at the moment, where we're trying to address a lot of these kinds of issues. How do we manage for forest production at the same time we're being responsible with carbon, species management, that sort of thing.
And maybe the final question or comment from Leif. Leif, you have it here on chat, but do you want to go ahead and speak to it?
I can, sure.
Oh.
Hey, Leif.
Dave. Hey, Dave. Good. How are you?
So we have to talk on the phone even though we're both in Seattle.
I know it. So I had a question for you. You were talking about essentially one aspect of, carbon sinks and the fact that just from an ecological perspective, there'll be challenges in the future. And my question was kind of a spin on that, and that is, if land management agencies are focused on maintaining or increasing carbon sinks in the form of trees, for instance, could you ever picture some kind of interagency carbon exchange that's used in the future, not in as much for ecological perspective, but sort of to meet these requirements that are coming down through executive orders?
Well, I've never heard that one. It sounds like kind of a pseudo cap and trade.
Yes.
Gosh, anything's possible. I mean, it will be very interesting in the future to see if federal lands are considered as a collective entity for carbon.
Right.
Or if we do it like we do everything else, which is agency by agency, and then we decentralize it beyond that. So I don't know how to respond to that, but it's an intriguing idea.
We'll revisit in a few years.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, Dave, I want to thank you for today's presentation and discussion, and I've posted your email address up here on the whiteboard that I think folks can see, wild@u.washington.edu.
Yep.
And there were some questions about whether you'd be willing to share copies of your PowerPoint, and I'll just let maybe people email you about that. And I want to remind folks that we will post the recording on the C3 YouTube channel, which you can find. It does have one of those long URLs, but if you just, do a search for C3 in YouTube, you should be able to find this probably posted by next week. So thanks again, Dave. And then for members of C3, we will have a business meeting on this line, so stay on the line. We'll get that started in a few minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, David. Bye now.
Thank you, David.